Good evening to everyone. My name is Peter Loewen. I'm the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and it's a real pleasure to be here today for this auspicious event with this great colleague of ours. I want to just do two things at the start. One is to acknowledge the land in which the University of Toronto operates. It has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Seneca, and more recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we're just so lucky to be here and to live and to work and to operate on this land. The second thing I want to tell you is that if you're a friend of Lucan, there's reserved seats at the front. Come on in.
Everybody's my friend.
Pleased to have you here.
Everybody move up.
But I'm going to turn it over to Ed Schatz in just a second for Ed to do some formal introductions. But I just wanted to say two things about our great colleague Lucan Way before I let Ed do a proper introduction to him. One is that once every 10 years or so, Lucan decides to write a book that sets a mark in the field in political science. It's quite a thing to do it once. It's quite a thing to do it again. So it's really remarkable to be a colleague of Lucan's and to see the depth and the breadth and the ambition and the quality of his work. So I'm genuinely really awed by the work that Lucan does. The second thing is that talk about timing and talk about commitment. Lucan has devoted his life to understanding the evolution of democracy and the retreat of democracy in some places and its general thriving. And he's also spent a bunch of his life with a passionate commitment to democracy in Eastern Europe, not least in Ukraine. And sometimes the moment meets the person. And I just want to say in front of all of you how deeply thankful I am for all the work that Lucan's done to provide intellectual leadership at our university around Ukraine, and all the personal work he's done to make our university a place that's more engaged with Ukraine. It's already been very engaged, by the way, but it'll be even more engaged, even more committed to our Ukrainian students here and Ukrainian students abroad. So Lucan, thank you very, very much for that from the bottom of my heart. And now I'm smiling because I saw Ed's notes and I thought about stealing his joke off the start, but I'm not going to. I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, Ed Schatz, and I ask you to welcome to the podium. Ed.
Now I have to quickly think of a joke that I'm supposed to. Okay. It's slightly awkward to help launch a book that is in fact entirely self-launching. For people who study comparative politics, we've been waiting for Lucan Way and Steve Levitsky's Revolution and Dictatorship in the same way that my teenager waits for the new Taylor Swift album. We've been on the edge of our collective seats since the last installment of Way and Levitsky's brilliance, and now we're all ready to dance, even though the topic is maybe a little less uplifting. Lucan, as everyone will know, is professor of political science here at the University of Toronto. He's the coordinator of the Petro Yatsik program for the study of Ukraine, active, as we've heard a little bit from Peter Loewen, active faculty member both at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and at Munk much more generally. And we really are lucky to have him here. But Lucan, as many of you will know, is not just a terrific scholar, he's a terrific friend. He's an old friend with whom I shared Adam Ulam's old office at the Davis Center for Russian Studies, then called the Davis Center for Russian Studies, replete with, remember, the rusty bathtub and the drafty windows. I hope you remember that, Lucan.
I do. You forgot the prescription drugs that were still
in the prescription drugs still in the medicine cabinet, of course.
Steve, Ed and I had a great time.
We had a great time. But we're not here because of that. We're not here because of friendships. We are here because Lucan is indeed a terrific scholar. In addition to his innumerable articles in some of the most high-profile places in political science, certainly for comparative politics scholars, World Politics, Journal of Democracy, Post-Soviet Affairs, and so on. His book, as Peter mentioned, with Steve Levitsky on comparative authoritarianism, defined an entire field and gave us a way to talk about hybrid political regimes. And this vocabulary is entirely relevant today as we witness the erosion of institutions, across the globe, the United States, Hungary, Brazil, just to mention a few. And that book, and I'm not bitter, in addition to being cited more than many of us are cited in our entire careers, also offered an interesting way forward methodologically. It offered a medium N methodology that was incredibly demanding. It was neither the small N work that allows in-depth detail on particular cases, nor was it large N work that seeks to produce broad theoretical generalizations. Instead, this was an effort to do both, and much, much harder methodologically. But Lucan and Steve are not easily daunted, as many of you will know. And it's this willingness to take the harder route that characterizes their work throughout. And I would say that allows it to have such an impact. I'll give the floor to Lucan in just a second, but let me say that we're lucky to have comments from two additional dear friends and terrific colleagues. Lynn Viola will be joining us online in just a second. Oh, there she is. Hi, Lynn. And Joe Wong. Randall Hansen, unfortunately, has come down with one of the nasties that's circulating in November in 2022, so he won't be joining us, though he was on the program, and he sends his best wishes. Just a bit about Lynn first. Lynn Viola is professor now emerita in the history department and one of the world's greatest specialists in 20th century Russian history, focusing on the political and social history of Russia, including topics like gender, rurality, political culture, and violence in the era of Stalin. She is the author of over 30 articles, 5 books, and the editor or co-editor of 19 books, including most recently Laboratories of Terror, which came out just this year with Oxford University Press, which is a terrific volume that assembles some of the first local histories about the Great Terror. And it's also the first volume to appear in English to use archival materials from recently opened security police archives in Ukraine. Just a first-rate scholar that we've been lucky to rub shoulders with over the years. So hello remotely, Lynn. Joe Wong, Vice Provost and Associate Vice President, International Student Experience. Joe is the Ralph and Roz Halbert Professor of Innovation here at the Monk School and Professor of Political Science as well. He's held the Canada Research Chair in Health, Democracy, and Development, and once upon a time was the director of Monk's Asian Institute. Widely published, Joe most recently published with Dan Slater a path-breaking volume called From Development to Democracy, The Transformations of Modern Asia. We look forward to the comments from our esteemed colleagues. They're really well positioned to take Lucan's terrific contributions seriously. This is a celebration. This is a celebration of incredible work. It's a celebration of our being lucky to have Lucan here. And we look forward to the conversation that this will generate. Lucan, congratulations on a wonderful book.
Right. Thanks. It's a real pleasure. I mean, this kind of book, which encompasses multiple continents, is very much a product of a village. We cover areas which I do not have primary expertise. So it's really, it's a pleasure to have people like Joe Wong, who studies Asia, and the great Lynn Viola, who's a historian of the Soviet Union. I mean, this book is really a product of their incredible patience and willingness to put up with my stupid questions, and also make sure I didn't make any embarrassing mistakes. And please don't mention them now if you found them. Anyways, it's a real pleasure, and to see all of my friends here who've been so supportive. And this book literally began. I sent off the grant application for this book the day before my kids were born. It was the last day of freedom, so I decided to use it to write grant applications. Anyways, and now I think they're like 22. Not close, they're 11, but so it's a little bit embarrassing, but they're like, Dad, why are you so slow? Anyway, so that's the deal. So I'm going to talk about the book briefly, but before I do, there's a little movie, a preview. Any questions? Okay. That was great. I love what I love is a publisher that has a preview, a sort of sneak peek, of your book. That's amazing. Anyways, so this book is really tries to explain the resilience of a set of autocracies that have really presented the most serious challenges to the liberal world order. They've attacked capitalism and the like, and tried to impose their Sharia law. they've also been among the most durable regimes in modern history. As you see here, revolutionary regimes have, on average, been in power for 39 years versus 15 years for non-revolutionary regimes. And it's not just that they've survived for a long time, but they've survived a massive crises, large-scale famine, severe economic downturn, as well as severe external pressure, like Iran, Vietnam. Think of the Vietnam War. Think of the sort of intense pressure put on Cuba in the 1960s. They've remained intact despite this, the fall of communism and the like. So the first question is, well, what do we mean by this revolutionary autocracy? So I think a lot of us, when we think of revolution, we think of things like the Orange Revolution or the Arab Spring. These are cases in which mass protests go on the street and they overthrow an autocrat. That was the Arab Spring. But the thing about those revolutions, they're quite frequent, relatively frequent, but they actually don't affect most of the population. So when I was in Ukraine during, Ukraine has a revolution basically every 5 years. The sort of the Orange Revolution, Maidan. One of the striking things is that in the center, the capital, you'd have these massive protests, these inspiring events. I mean, truly inspiring. But you'd go about 3 blocks away, and life was just completely normal. There was no change. And indeed, most of these kind of political revolutions don't affect, the way most people live, right? This is not the kind of, this is not the case for the kind of social revolutions that we investigate in this book. Here you have, in addition to the large crowds and, flags and stuff, you also have things like this, fundamental efforts to change the culture that people live in, to destroy the old way of living things. This is from the Taliban, destroying old art. You also have things like this, efforts to assassinate and kill landowners and the rich, right here. And, and when you try to kill the rich, they fight back and you have wars. And so, and you have this. And so ultimately, revolution is won not just by demonstrators in the streets, as in the Arab Spring and the Orange Revolution, but also soldiers in the battlefield. I mean, that's what really distinguishes these social revolutions. So, revolutionary autocracies emerge out of social revolution, where you have the overthrow of government involving mass mobilization, like in any revolution, but also violence, fundamental transformation of the state. The old army is destroyed. This happens very rarely. And also you have major efforts at social transformation, end of private property, Sharia law. Now, there just aren't that many of them. There are 20. We've scoured the records. We found since 1920 of these cases. There are overall about 350 autocracies in the world since 1900. This is, about 7% of them. So, you have, a good share of them are still around, about close to half, about 9 of 20. But still, it's, why study something that is so rare? What does it matter? Well, I think it's worth studying because they are small in number, but very important. They are the source of new global ideologies. Communism, Islamism. My wife says I pronounce Islamism like a white boy. I apologize. She repeats it. I just still can't get it. I have a white boy here. That's what I was born with. Global powers, the Soviet Union, China. Global crises, Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam War, Iran hostage crisis, 9/11. These are all products of revolutionary regimes. And today you have threats to the liberal order. The 2 major threats to the global order in some ways are definitely China, but also Iran, which are both revolutionary regimes. And I think in a different way, Russia, which I'll discuss separately, which is not a revolutionary regime, but I think reflects revolutionary origins. And so it is very important to understand, why they're so durable. And, here we see this Kaplan-Meier, just to sort of, you're not convinced they're durable. This sort of shows the revolutionary regimes at the top, surviving much longer on average than non-revolutionary regimes. So the question is why? And what's even more puzzling is that when you think of China especially, but also Iran, you think of these relatively strong regimes, what we forget is that these began incredibly weak. So when Lenin came to power in 1917, he barely controlled the neighborhood of the party headquarters in Petrograd. You know, they had, you know, the state was incredibly weak. You still had major opposition throughout the country. You know, a good part of the country was controlled by whites. And, you know, similarly with Khomeini, when he comes to, you know, in 1979, you know, he's very popular, but basically the state has broken down in Iran. He's head of this ramshackle coalition of secular nationalists, communists, and clerics. And he basically has no tools for governing other than his celebrity, right? And, you know, so normally you think of dictators, or they're in this position where they're weak, you know, they're weak, they want to stay in power. So the natural inclination would be to sort of make allies, try to, like, you know, accommodate different groups, make a big ruling coalition, because if you wanted to stay in power, you try to make as many friends as you can. Revolutionaries do the opposite. They declare war on the world. They do things like attack, you know, the rich and the powerful. They declare war on the most, you know, powerful country in the world, the United States. Right, and they engage in this kind of radical behavior. Here's a picture of Lenin, like, wiping out the monarchy, capitalism, the church, and the like. And so what this does, if you declare a war on the world fights back, and you have conflict. And indeed, 17 of 20 of these cases, you know, after they came to power, they engaged in this radical behavior. They had, you know, significant counter-revolutionary conflicts. So in China and Russia, you have civil war. In Iran, you have the Iran-Iraq war. In Cuba, Castro faces massive US-backed insurgency. So you have incredible, you know, violent conflict. And often, as in Cambodia and the first Taliban in the 1990s, you're destroyed. That destroys you. That's the end of it, right? But what doesn't kill you? Yeah, I can hear you. Makes you stronger. And there are sort of basically three ways in which it makes you stronger. A unified party, a strong, loyal army, and destruction of alternatives. And I'm going to briefly go through these. You know, first of all, it creates a unified ruling party. This sort of existential threats, you know, and life and death struggle. It creates this intense siege mentality in which defection equals treason. And in most of these parties, especially the Soviet Union and, you know, and China, it creates this almost quasi-religious devotion to unity, right? So that, and a lot of dictatorships are overthrown, you know, by defections from on top. And so this is a major source of durability. Second, you know, it creates a strong and loyal army or security services. So war, you know, motivates, as many people have pointed out, the building of strong militaries, which is one thing. Second, you know, they create new armed forces from scratch, right? So most dictators, they inherit militaries from the old regime, and the military sort of operates at arm's length from them. And so, you know, as a result, these dictatorships face a lot of coups. These are sort of formed from scratch. They're able to basically penetrate the military in a way that non-revolutionary regimes are not. Oftentimes, the military often, you know, almost always share the ideological vision of the revolutionaries. And so as a result, you have far fewer coups, military coups in revolutionary regimes. Finally, you have the destruction of alternative centers of power, by which I mean, so in most dictatorships, you have, you know, institutions like the church, private sector, which oftentimes provide sort of safe haven for opposition activities, right? So the church, you know, provides refuge for activists. The private sector can fund the opposition. And so, you know, but in revolutionary regimes, you have none of this. All of this is wiped clean, such that the revolutionary dictatorship stands alone and faces no real challenges to its power. So as a result, you get durability. So that's the sort of this is this elevator ride pitch. It's a very long elevator ride. You're like, well, when are we gonna get to the floor? I stop now. Anyways, so that's it. And what you get is sort of, as a result, revolutionary regimes, revolutionary origins prevent the three main causes of authoritarian breakdown. The first are divisions on the top. Oftentimes, you know, dictatorships are not overthrown, mostly not by, you know, by the population in protest, but by sort of people, you know, allies of the dictator who decides that, you know, they could do a better job. and that they could stay in power more if they were in charge of the defection. So, and this sort of intense unity prevents divisions at top. It also prevents, as I mentioned, military coup, and also guards against mass protests. First of all, you have a very strong military that's able to put down the protests, but you also don't have these safe havens, these alternative centers of power that allow opposition to survive. So that's basically the argument. So, but today, because you came, I'm giving you bonus material. This is not in the book. These are like fresh thoughts, mainly. It's like, oh, thinking on the way here, I was like, so this is just like, in action, man. So I was thinking a lot about Russia, right? Thinking about, and Russia is an interesting, oops, oh no, how do I get back? Someone help me. How do I screwed everything up? How do I? My wife usually gives all the help I need, but I'm at the very end. Yeah. Okay. So Putin's Russia is not a revolutionary regime. The Soviet Union did collapse. Your memories are not incorrect. And also, Putin did not come to power through violence. He basically won the lottery. He was this obscure official, this deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia in the 1990s, plucked him from obscurity, made him his successor, and lo and behold, right? So Russia is not one of those 9 cases that survived. Nonetheless, it's clear that Putin's power is still very much rooted in 1917 in 2 ways. First, Soviet totalitarianism, 74 years of it, wiped out any form of civil society or opposition. And in the 1990s, this began to emerge. I was lucky enough to live in Moscow at the time. These were a lot of my friends. I mean, it was a very exciting time, but these were weak forces, and democracy from the beginning was quite vulnerable. Second, you have, at the same time that you have a weak opposition, you have the world's most powerful security force, the KGB, which, the Communist Party virtually disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the KGB did not. It was called something different, but the core organization remained intact. Today it's called the FSB. And so on one side you have a very weak opposition, and another you have a very, very world historically powerful security service. And so there was no contest, to put it mildly, sadly. And finally, I think Putin, of course, had his career in the KGB, and very much of his psychology, I think, his kind of conspiratorial mindset, as well as his kind of deep suspicion of the West, can to a large extent be traced back to 1917. So I think Russia's this case in which it's not a revolutionary regime, but revolutionary legacies, I think, still continue to play a powerful role today in preventing democracy. So thank you very much.
I guess I just want to turn it over to Lynn Viola. I'm not sure how to do that. Maybe. Terrific. Lynn, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ed. Nice to see you as well. Nice to see Lucan. And it's my great pleasure to congratulate you, Lucan. It's a fantastic book. I'm very proud to be your colleague. I'd also like to congratulate the co-author of this book, Steve Levitsky, who teaches in a small university south of Halifax. Some of you may have heard of. They call it the University of Toronto of the South. In any case, their co-written book is really an excellent example of comparative politics. It provides new tools with which to understand and analyze a wide and impressive array of authoritarian regimes which began in social revolution. The book demonstrates the durability of such regimes using a series of 3 main factors: a cohesive ruling elite, a strong and loyal apparatus, including the military and the security police, and the destruction of power alternatives in politics and society. Now, what I especially liked in this study, and I liked a lot, and there's a lot in there. I must say I learned such a great deal from reading this. But what I especially liked, and here I'll base what I will say on the chapter in the Soviet Union, is the author's emphasis on the reactive nature of these states, because I think that's very important. So we see, for example, in the case of the Soviet Union, that each successive crisis up to and including World War II produces a reaction that further strengthens not only Levitsky and Way's main factors, but this very strong state, this durable authoritarian state. Now, I've always seen Stalinism as reactive. The vast peasant rebellions of the Civil War and of the collectivization period produced in their wake a more repressive state, something that earlier scholars of peasant studies have noted in the case of peasant revolts elsewhere. But I think what's most important is that by looking at the reactive nature of politics and policies, we are able to see a certain kind of authoritarian state pragmatism, which was as important, perhaps more important than ideology, a factor that has been overemphasized for decades and actually made a comeback in the 90s. By looking at the reactive nature of politics and policies, we also get a sense of why. We see the crises that occurred in these supposedly all-powerful states. So you have a much more dynamic situation. Now, I do have a few questions that I'd like to pose to Lucan as a social historian. And I must apologize. I have a feeling I'm in a room full of political scientists. And as a historian, I feel a real handicap here, since my last book was limited to a couple of months in 1937. But you explicitly and quite honestly say that your theory is top-down and state-centric. Now, I appreciate this, but still, I am a social historian, so you will indulge me. I wonder that at least in the case of the Soviet Union and likely elsewhere, you don't see that the vast social mobility, accompanied, of course, by a repressive downward mobility, that this vast social mobility was an additional legitimating factor in the durability of some of these regimes. This is something that Sheila Fitzpatrick talked about already from the 1980s. And I think it did provide a great deal of support, urban support initially. But of course, by the late Stalin period and the post-Stalin period, the elites were all the product of upward social mobility during the first 5-year plan. And I think this was a regime legitimizing strength, which then in the end led to stagnation, because they held on to power to the point of embarrassment. Which leads me to the second sort of general area I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on. Lucan, I wondered about the idea that, quote, in the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was, by any measure, a stable authoritarian regime. Now, I don't want to suggest that there was political opposition, but I do want to suggest that this regime was deteriorating from within. It was stagnating from within. And in fact, it was quite visible. I was there in the early part of the 80s and then several times in the second half of the 80s. And you could just see this, you could feel it, you could hear it in people's conversations, discussions. To me, Gorbachev was more of a result than a cause of the destabilization that brought down the Soviet Union. The system rotted from within, especially in the later part of the Brezhnev years. For me, Gorbachev instead really suffered the fate of the typical reformer, at least in Russian history, caught between those who wanted to defend the old order and those who saw such reform as too little and too late. I also kind of like Gorbachev. So unlike every Russian I know. Anyway, these conclusions aside, I love the book, and that I think you've authored something that will assist many scholars and policy makers alike to understand why these regimes are so durable. I also think the book will be durable, which is saying quite a lot in our times. So thank you very much, Lucan.
Yeah, that's fine. Sure. Thank you so much. Let me begin by just expressing how deeply honored I am to be able to comment on Stephen Lucan's most recent book. I was truly flattered when Lucan asked me if I would make some comments. At first, I thought he just wanted me to come to the book launch, and then a copy of the book arrived. And I thought, oh, shit, I've got to read the whole thing, and I've got to make some comments. I was also very buoyed to hear, Lucan, that it took you and Steve so long to write this book because, as you know, my co-author Dan Slater and I were writing our book around the same time. And I have this image in my head now of two tortoises competing to see who could take longer and be slower in getting their books done. And I guess I'm pleased to say that our book came out 3 weeks before yours. Look, this is a celebration. And so there are, I hope, many opportunities for us to get into some of the details of the book. And I would love to be able to do the kind of close read and interrogation that our colleague Lynn just provided. But I really wanted to just say from the outset, in a very celebratory way, congratulations to both Steve and Lucan. As I was reading the book, I couldn't help myself but actually reflect on some other books that I've read of this ilk throughout my political science career. And it actually brought me back to when I was a graduate student. And one of the most dog-eared books on my bookshelf is the one by Theda Skocpol, States and Social Revolutions. And Ed and I were actually in grad school together. You recall when we were writing our comps, we had a whole year to study for our comps, right? And this is where you would spend a whole year reading everything there is to read in comparative politics. And this was the pre-digital age. So I had all of my notes on cue cards, literally thousands of cue cards. And the way in which I could the only way in which I could remember everything, which I was expected to spew out in my comps, was to really sort of map the literature, right? To think about the literature as a kind of genealogy, and the way in which literature spoke to other literatures, and the way in which literature is built on theories and so forth. And one of the things that I found was that in my notes, SSR showed up a lot. And that was States and Social Revolutions. That was one of these nodal books within this genealogical network of our knowledge in political science, SSR. And I suspect that, I know with full confidence, that the latest Levitsky and Way volume will do the same. What binds all of these books together, the SSRs of the world? What binds them together is that this book at its core, it's a big book. It's empirically so beautifully written. It's so rich, it's so detailed, but it's driven by a theory. And it's a book filled with detailed empirical analysis, but one that is yet disciplined by a theory. And actually the theory can be captured very simply in this phrase, revolutionary reactive sequence, or as I suspect will be in many graduate students' notes here on out, RRS. And that was throughout my notes, RRS. It's an extremely elegant theory. It's built on 3 pillars that Lucan's already described for you. They're 3 pillars that are in many ways intuitive. They're easy to understand. It's also at the same time extremely compelling because it's a counterintuitive theory, right? I mean, one of the consequences or one of the theoretical implications of the argument is that the more radical your counter-revolutionary reactive sequences or your revolutionary reactive sequences, the more radical, the less accommodationist, the more likely the regime is to remain durable, right? This in many ways seems counterintuitive. You would think that the more accommodationist, the more encompassing would be durable, but actually it's the opposite. I love the theory because it's a theory about processes over preconditions. So we can talk about this theory in different time, in different space, across different geographies, across different cultural contexts. It has a kind of fungibility and portability that maybe wasn't intended as Steve and Lucan were writing the book, but one that I think will inform lots of debates. And again, not just on the preconditions, but the logical process by which they trace out their argument. And as Lucan says, though there are few cases, and indeed when I look back to Skocpol's book, States and Social Revolutions, it was really built on 3 cases and 2 shadow cases. There are a few cases, but they are arguably the most consequential cases imaginable, right? In terms of Russia in establishing the Cold War or the Cold War context, Iran, of course, now dividing the world in new ways. I thought the chapter on Mexico was fascinating because it was a way of understanding a kind of partial accommodationist strategy. And I think it really speaks to then the kind of dominant regime we see there under the PRI. Vietnam is fascinating because in many ways it's shaping the post-Cold War order in fundamentally new ways, in contradistinction to, of course, the elephant in the room that I think about a lot, and that is China. It's an incredibly tremendous book, because what Steve and Lucan are doing here is that they are asking the big questions. We so rarely in political science now ask the big questions. I think in many ways, and I lament, and maybe it's just a function of my age, I lament that we no longer ask the big questions, and we have done so by sacrificing the big questions in authoritatively answering the small ones. What Lucan and Steve here have done is they've re-asked the big questions that animate our field, and it deserves to be in the pantheon of those classic books. Now, as I noted, I have just finished writing a book that was just published, and I sent Lucan a note. I said, look, dude, I can't read this book without thinking about what Slater and I had just produced. And in fact, we have the same editor, same press, you know, and we were the same irritant, I suppose, with respect to the length it took for us to read this, to write this. But I can't help but not think about it. So I asked Lucan's permission, if it was all right, that I reflect a little bit about the contributions of the book set against what Dan and I had just written. So in one sense, you know, the book that Lucan and Steve have written is similar to what Dan and I had written, in the sense that it is also driven by a theory. But they're fundamentally different because they're asking fundamentally different questions. And as a result, they also draw very different conclusions. Take, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party in 1989. Steve and Luca will make the argument that the CCP in 1989 was strong enough to remain durable. Yet in Slater and Wong, we argue that it was too weak to concede. Is it conceivable that we're both wrong? Is it conceivable that we're both right? Do we have the facts even straight at all, right? We're reading the same literature, we're consulting the same resources, and yet we come up with what are seemingly very different conclusions. The point I want to say here is that what Lucan and Steve are doing here is they're really dealing with a very complex real world, and the only way to make sense of this complicated real world is to discipline it with a theory. Their book is in the business of explaining, and their explanations have consequences. And so the theory that they are trying to argue, the facts that they are exploring to make a persuasive argument, leads them to conclude that the regime is strong enough to be durable. Our theory is a different theory, and therefore we sort out the facts in fundamentally different ways. Take, for example, the treatment of ideology, right? Again, in the way in which Dan and I think about it, we think about the Chinese Communist Party and the ideological legacy of the revolution as being as the content being hostile to democracy, that it's inconceivable that China could ever think about democratizing because the content of the ideology is inhospitable to a democratic outcome. Lucan and Steve also argue that ideology matters, but in very different ways. In fact, they're less concerned about content. The fact that the revolutionary ideology exists gives the regimes the permissions to behave, as you put it, recklessly, and I think even at times irrationally, right? So again, ideology features very prominently in these two studies, but treated very differently, and they're treated very differently because they are treated differently in different theories. The point I want to make here is that a book that is driven by theory is one that I think elides the hubris to think that we can get it all right. But rather, what he does here is that he allows fact, or both Steve and Lucan, allows fact to inform and support their theory. The book is a theory. I noted earlier on that a few weeks ago, that my old doctoral advisor used to ask me after I would read a 500-page book, and he would say, "So, did you like the book?" "Yeah, it was a great book. It was really good." "Yeah. What was it about?" "Well, it was about this, it was about that, it was a little bit about this." He said, no, what was it about? Can you describe to me what the contribution of the book was? And that to me then became the hallmark of what a good book is. And that's what makes this book so phenomenal. It is a book driven by a theory, the revolutionary reactive sequence, or RRS. Let me give you one last example, and this is on the question of durability. This is a really fascinating question because it's all about strength over time. Chinese Communist Party has been in power now for around 70 years. Lucan and Steve refer to this and conceive of this as a durable autocratic regime, as something that is being, as a very old and long-standing and resilient autocratic regime. Dan and I think of it as a very young regime because our temporal horizon in terms of the durability of a regime is one in which we're set against this notion of forever. No regime lasts forever, and therefore a regime might one day consider democratizing. Or, as Joe Wong points out in a recent piece, actually the Chinese Communist Party, in the grand history of the length of regimes in China, is simply average. So in many ways, the question that I would have for Lucan and Steve is, how long does a revolutionary legacy last, right? We've seen, for instance, and I think again in the example of China, as well as in Mexico, this notion of kind of the continual re-revolutionization of these regimes. But over time, the re-revolutionization of the regimes moved from a very radical impulse at the start that allows for the durable foundations to be set, but over time might become, as you allude to, much more performance legitimacy formulas, right? That these are then now regimes that are based on an increasingly accommodationist strategy. And there I have to ask then, where does the role, for instance, this economic development play? And it features, not very prominently in your story. And I think in many ways, probably because you assume the reader already knows that and really understands that. But the transformation from a revolutionary legitimacy to a performance-based legitimacy is the preoccupation of so many scholars of China today, including most recently, a terrific piece by Liz Perry. One last thing I would just simply say is that in many ways, therefore, the argument that you're making here is very compatible with the argument that Dan and I make, except that we are approaching it with different timescales. And again, we approach it with different timescales because of our theories. What you offer in this book, therefore, is not just a comprehensive account. What you offer in this book is an incredibly persuasive account. Let me say in closing, this book will be a classic. This is something that scholars say quite casually. I think that almost every book that I blurb on the back, I will say something along the lines of this is a classic or sure to be a classic and it's a must read. It is bandied about far too casually, but I think it also has to be assessed very seriously. And why is this book going to be a classic? It's going to be a classic because it covers just an extraordinary scope. I mean, it is just a masterful account of so many cases that when you leave, you feel like you have learned something about all of these different countries, and not just about their contemporary settings, but also their histories. It's going to be a classic because, as I've already suggested, it's asking the big questions that scholars that are more faint of heart dare not ask. I fear that so many times scholars ask the little questions, the derivative questions, but they are derivative questions of precisely the questions that Steve and Lucan are asking here. This book is going to be a classic because it is going to become part of the lingua franca of political science. There are some phrases in political science that everybody knows. No bourgeoisie, no democracy, embedded autonomy, revolution from above, and indeed another Levitsky way, competitive authoritarianism. These are marks in the field that then cause everyone else to have to react to. It sets the pick that everyone else has to adjust to. And indeed, that is one of the reasons why this is going to be a classic. And it's going to be a classic because it's a theory. It's driven by a theory. When you're asked, what is this book about? It's a book about all these cases, it's a book about all these sequences, but it's a book about a very elegant theory. It's a theory that I can explain. It's a theory that I can understand. It's a theory that I can apply. It's a theory that I will occasionally challenge. But for all of us, it will be a theory that we all have to contend with moving forward. So congratulations again, Lucan and Steve.
The mic is on now? Okay, great. Can you all hear me? Is that through the mic or no? Can't tell. Okay, we'll just use a old professorial voice. There you go. Okay, thank you so much. So what I was thinking is that we could just give Lucan a chance. Do you want to respond to some of these things first, or?
I think just open it up. I mean, I could.
Okay, so then why don't we do this? I'm going to pose a first question while those in the audience, first question, in addition to everything else that's been put on the table. And I think there are cards that have been circulated. So if you go ahead and write it down, and somebody should be able to collect the cards and bring them up. And I'll have a look and we'll pose those questions, as many as we can, to Lucan. So first of all, I want to thank Lynn and Joe for those incredibly thoughtful remarks. They're generous remarks because this really is genuinely a terrific book. It's enormously important. It's enormous. But I want to assure you, those of you who are not likely to read a 700-page book, that this is not a 700-page book. This is a 357-page book with a lot of footnotes. Okay, so maybe that's a little bit better. But it is written with incredible clarity, and I think the reason why Joe and Lynn can engage it so directly is because of this impressive clarity, which I shall say is not as common as one would want it to be in our profession. Let me add one thing that, just by way of compliments, thank you for these questions coming in. One of the things that wasn't mentioned that I particularly like is, you have this incredible range of cases, 20 cases being covered, but at the same time, Steve and Lucan are honest where it doesn't fit perfectly, right? So there's a theory, and the analysis is driven by theory, but there's an intellectual honesty in talking about, what are they, Finland and Nicaragua, right? The two cases where there are other things going on that seem to swamp the theory. Now, that doesn't invalidate the theory. No theory is a perfect fit. You should be worried about theories that are almost too good to be true, because they probably are. And this is one of the things that we saw in competitive authoritarianism. It's something that we see in this book as well, and that it opens up further discussion. This is a conversation starter, not designed to end conversation, and that's particularly welcome. Let me ask one question, and then we'll turn to what's on the cards here. Lucan, you've also written about democracy, right? Not a little bit. You've written a lot about democracy. And I want to know, if you zoom even further back, right? This has got a big purview here. If you zoom out even further, what would you say about the durability of democracy versus, you identify three factors here as crucially important. do they speak at all to the kinds of things that make democracies endure? Or are they entirely different factors? And if that's the case, I mean, how do you sort of tangle with that difference? I'm asking you to reconcile all you've done for the study of autocracy with all you've done for the study of democracy, and you have 30 seconds. So go ahead.
The next book.
Do you want to go ahead and answer some of these questions while I?
Okay, I can just quickly. I mean, first of all, I
don't think you need it.
Okay. I think for the recording we do.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to thank. I mean, again, I mean, just so lovely to hear from Lynn. You know, I mean, Lynn, I just want to emphasize. You know, she knows so much more than I do, and was so patient when with me, and she having graduate seminars on the Soviet Union. It was such a pleasure. And Joe, my God, like you always rely on Joe for these amazing comments, and Ed, what a great question. So I just want to say, I think first of all, we are very much of a top-down argument, unapologetically so, and I think public opinion just doesn't matter in these cases. These regimes, public opinion, that's a bourgeois notion. That's what Stalin would say. There is no public opinion. It's class warfare. We don't give a flying about what the public thinks because we're interested in class warfare. And indeed, they did things to alienate the population. They sort of killed millions of people. We don't have surveys from the time, but we can be pretty sure, for example, when Mao killed 30 to 40 million people, that was not especially popular policy. And these massive purges in the Soviet Union in the 1930s so there were sort of people who had a stake in the regime, but overall the population as a whole suffered enormous. These were horrible places to live in. You just do not, you wish upon your worst enemy to live in a revolutionary autocracy. And so we just don't see, at least in the first 40 years, where public opinion matters. I think it does matter in later stages. So, I mean, this is very, as Joe mentioned, nothing survives forever, and these legacies have a kind of best by date. And the first thing that happens is when the core generation that originally engaged in this violent struggle dies off. The regime becomes less cohesive, and that's exactly what Lynn was pointing to in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. They started by the ideologues who sort of were experienced this sort of existential threat to their survival, and then they're successful, and in some ways they're victims of their own success because they become complacent. And a lot of what Xi is doing right now is he's saying we can't be complacent. I mean, we have to sort of maintain the revolutionary heritage, which is about this sort of fear of repeating this experience of the Soviet Union where it became so soft that it just collapsed. And so we're unapologetically saying, no, public opinion is not the main, driver of this durability. In response to sort of Joe's comments, I mean, I think, part of the, when I wrote this chapter on China, every sort of explanation of China rightly focuses on the incredible amount of economic development that occurred under, in China, from after 1978. I mean, between 1978 and 2019, the Chinese economy has literally grown 13-fold. I mean, that's astounding. But the problem with those accounts is they forget that that just a few generations ago, China was essentially like Afghanistan. It was an extraordinarily weak, it had no central state, it was run by warlords. And furthermore, when Mao came to power, he engaged in all sorts of, hugely irrational and deadly policies, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and so to understand where it even got to the point where you had a central state that had the power to engage in this kind of economic reform, you first of all had to be around. You couldn't have collapsed. You have to understand the revolutionary origin. So we can't explain why there was economic development, but we can explain why the Chinese Communist regime survived long enough and had enough institutional mechanisms to carry out this reform. And this is sort of, I think, a necessary, if not obviously not sufficient, part of the explanation for its durability. And furthermore, I think we do a pretty good job of explaining why, in contrast to South Korea and Taiwan,
you've had this enormous economic development, but basically almost no pro-democratic movement. Because the legacies of revolution, you have this uniquely strong state that reaches down into every nook and cranny of society, controls both private and public sector, that make, as a result, China today has a much, a level of weak civil society that's in line with sort of these underdeveloped countries like Libya and Tajikistan. And finally, in reaction to Ed's question, I think in my new book is going to be about democratic durability, but I think they have very different sources. I think authoritarian durability is essentially all about the coercive apparatus and cohesion, whereas democratic durability is about maintaining sort of pluralism of centers of power. And I'll leave it at that. But maybe we could just.
Great, thank you. I've got keep the questions coming if something comes to mind. I will ask a question from one of our talented now graduated students. Lucan, do you believe that authoritarians are using digital technologies as tools of power to further ensure the durability of their rule? I guess the question might be, rephrased. I mean, how would the technological changes that we've, been witnessing over the past couple of decades play into your factors that you find to be particularly important?
Yes, I think that obviously they have been. I think that certainly the way China has been using them, I think, the degree of efficacy of the digital technologies in China is grounded in revolutionary origins. I mean, I think it allowed, provided a particularly close ties between technology companies and the party that allowed the party and the technologies companies to work together to develop these, remarkably sophisticated techniques. So, and I should also add that, digital technologies aren't sufficient for authoritarian durability. Certainly, it's very hard to sort of repeat the Chinese experience. I think, other countries that just haven't been as effective. I mean, Iran especially. So I think digital technologies, it's not sufficient, but certainly it's important.
Got it. All right. This one starts with thanks for such a wonderful presentation. And I think many of them do. So I'm just going to say that once.
Okay.
We all agree. Some scholars are hesitant to call what's going on in Iran a revolution. What do you think? And I guess the more, put in more conceptual terms, how do you know revolution? I mean, when will we know that something is a revolution, especially if it's sort of thwarted in its early stages or mid stages, or doesn't end up in the story that you detailed today?
Well, all I can say is I certainly hope so. Now that my book has been published, but seriously, I mean, I just want to say, like all of us, I've been so, inspired by these young women who taken to the streets. Unfortunately, I'm just not terribly optimistic in the short term, mainly because Iran just has an incredibly powerful security force, the Revolutionary Guard, and we've seen the same pattern as we saw in 2009, as we saw in 2017 and 2019, where you see one thing that the regime, when it's faced with protests, doesn't make compromises as you saw in Egypt in 2011, but they push down harder. They start attacking young girls and doing incredibly unpopular acts, and you see exactly the same thing now. You also see where zero compromise. I mean, I think that the core elite of the Iranian regime unfortunately just shows every signs of remaining cohesive as it has in the past.
We can't end on that. We have to keep going. Okay, so here's a question. The question is, so what? Okay, so what? They're all authoritarian. They're durable. What does this mean for the people, for the world, or even the future of humankind? What's the major insight here? So let me actually do an add-on to this, which might why. Okay, somebody else should do this work because you've done plenty of work for this book, but why not think about an extension that somebody else can write, some of you, that would deal with some of the gray area cases, right? Because if the story that you tell is most clearly visible, because these are the extreme cases here, surely the logic should travel to those cases where the factors you identify are present, but they maybe don't achieve this full social revolution. Maybe they don't last as long, that kind of thing. I know you partially deal with that there, but I'm thinking a little bit about like a fuzzy set approach kind of thing. So there's the so what question, given that you've got these 20 cases, what's their significance? And could you answer that by extending or having somebody else extend it to cases that are sort of adjacent to the ones that you've got here?
So what? Two answers. One, these are just simply very consequential regimes. I mean, they create major. They're the source of almost all the 20th and 21st century global crises. So I think that's one answer to so what. The second answer, from a more kind of political science point of view, is that while there aren't that many revolutionary regimes, some of the pillars we see individually in other cases. To give you an example, Tanzania under the is very much not a revolutionary regime, but it, for a variety of reasons that I can go into, has came to other through equifinality fusion, and so it was, as a result, they haven't faced coup threats in the way that sort of other African regimes have. So I think the pillars can travel.
Got it. Let me ask a question of my own, because I don't remember. I'm sure you deal with this at the beginning. Maybe you just define the scope of what you're doing temporally to make it somewhat manageable. But you have social revolutions, don't you, in the United States? Does that count? And France. I mean, when we talk about democratic revolutions, I mean, I know you've done all this work because I know you teach these kinds of courses. So, I mean, those are not dictatorships, of course, that result. So this is, I mean, a way back to the question I was asking before. Is there a story of durability coming from revolution in, let's say, the United States that one could, extend from your analysis here?
So that's a great question. So I remember when I gave the Russian case, and this is something that that Joe alluded to, and the response was the Soviet Union survived 74 years. Well, Romanov dynasty was for 400 years, right? And I think the issue, first of all, there is a kind of temporal issue here, which is that we basically, 1900 is not a completely arbitrary date. It's when you have the beginnings of mass inclusion. So before 1900, the masses just didn't have any sort of, way of participating in politics on a regular basis. But because of economic modernization and industrialization, the masses become part of the story. So as a result, autocracies continue to exist, but they exist for much shorter periods of time. So the average autocracy is about 17 years, which is far less than the average dynasty in the sort of pre-modern era. So it's a kind of period after mass inclusion when authoritarianism becomes much harder. France, I don't think that America is a revolution. There wasn't the class structure remained very much intact before and after the revolution. Obviously France is a social revolution, and it doesn't work for our argument. I'm sorry. That's just the case. I mean, I could sort of expound on that. I mean, that's an interesting case, but that's obviously a case that doesn't work.
Great. Keep them coming. I've got some, we're going to pivot here to something a little bit more methodological, I guess. How did the theory develop? So in other words, how do you, how's the sausage made? I guess is what this is about. How did the theory develop? What was the process? Yes. What's the process of selecting cases, formulating concepts? Like, how do you do it? How do you get to this?
So first of all, Steve Levitsky and I have known each other forever. We were graduate. Literally, I think we met in 1993. So it's been really almost like a second marriage, and that is intellectual marriage. Don't worry. Anyways, but we have such a long friendship that and we share sort of broad sort of visions of what makes good for good social science. We agree on most things. And in some ways, this is a product of those 30 years of collaboration. I mean, most directly it came out of the last book, Competitive Authoritarianism, in which we made this argument that competitive authoritarian regimes like Zimbabwe that emerged out of violent struggle were more durable. And we sort of took that and sort of began to shift the focus a bit and sort of took history back, to the beginning of the 20th century. So that's where it came from. Case selection, I mean, that's always been a sort of a bane for us, because most social scientists who are in the qualitative tradition, they mostly work within one region. So the former Soviet Union, you have 12 cases, and you can that's a small enough number. Or Central Asia, 3 or 4 cases, and sort of it's easy to do qualitative work. We have since he studies Latin America, I studied I study the post-communist region. We can't you can't do a study like Latin America and the post-communist region. No one would take you seriously, and so we've ended up having to do basically the whole world. And so, which is, why, it's taken a decade to do this, and which is why it took a decade to write Competitive Authoritarianism, because there's no sort of logical, there's no stopping. And so in the competitive authoritarian regime, we just did every competitive authoritarian regime that existed in 1995. And here, we just did every social revolutionary regime that existed after 1900, because there's no other way of, making those kind of choices. So.
Yeah, this is something that happens. A lot of people would artificially contain their scope on some kind of notion of where their expertise lies. But back to Joe's comments, you're driven by a theory, and there's no particular reason that there are scope conditions, at least the factors you identify, that would limit you to Latin America only, or post-Soviet, or former socialist space only,
I have to say, it's also personal proclivity. I love learning about these small cases that no one knows anything about. So if anybody has a question about Finland, I just love these little cases that, Guinea-Bissau. Great case.
Okay.
Anyways.
Okay, let's do about 2 more questions, and then we'll retire to the reception. So I guess this is maybe the hazard of providing new material, right? You're inviting questions about the new material, right? The stuff about Putin. So this question is, if Putin's durability comes from, at least in part, the revolutionary legacy of the Soviet Union, then the same arguments should be applied to other former Soviet countries. How do we explain? I can't read this. How do you explain variation, basically, that we see in former Soviet space if the legacy is all Soviet?
Well, first of all, the answer is authoritarianism is done pretty well in the former Soviet Union as a whole, for reasons I think that are related to this. But it's not the only factor. Thank God. Slava Ukraini. This is, Ukraine, for a variety of other reasons that I can discuss, has escaped this legacy. To a certain extent, and so I guess that would be my answer.
Okay, all right, and then a final question. I'm not sure if this is logically the way to end, but I guess it comes out of your answer to Joe's comments, and it's about that pivot from the revolutionary legitimacy to performance-based legitimacy that you see in China. By that logic, there should have been a moment in the Soviet case where this was possible, right? And I guess A, is that right? And B, what was that moment, and why did it pass by in the Soviet case? I know this is something you and I have thought a lot about, but I wonder if you've just in thinking about Joe's remarks, you have anything else to say?
So I think the death of the founding generation is a kind of major choice point. And Yugoslavia is one extreme, where the death of the revolutionary generation led to people making decisions, about promotion of nationalism that quickly led to the collapse of Yugoslavia. And in China, for reasons that are sort of very contingent, I think, but there's some structural thing, Hong Kong and stuff, made a very different decision. And I think, the Soviet Union, I think there is sort of the role of leadership and contingency play a massive role. I think, why Gorbachev had this idea. I remember in the 80s, because I was in college, and you'd see people talking about this. The idea that the way to revitalize the economy was to have multi-party election or multi-candidate elections is utterly insane. I'm glad I like multi-candidate elections. Don't get me wrong, but that's not the way you revitalize an economy. And so who knows? You have to do a deep dive biography of Gorbachev to figure out where he got these ideas, but that is finally contingent.
Well, folks, this is Lucan Way in a nutshell, right? This bold, largely structural theory, but that generates such incredible conversations on a wide range of topics. And of course, intellectually. It's just a delight to have you here, because we end up with these conversations, irresolvable though they may be. At the end of the day, they're always stimulating and important. Thank you all. Let's congratulate Lucan and Steve on this great book.
And I want to say again, thank you for the tremendous support of the Center for European Russian Eurasian Studies, as well as the Monk School. Peter, this is an incredibly supportive intellectual environment, and thank you so much.
Great. And I believe there's something brewing off to the side, so help yourself. Thank you all for coming.
That was great.